let's talk a bit about AI sovereignty and global infrastructure, because the critical question from the lens of everyone involved in the AI Impact Summit in India is, can a country like India rely on AI as a global common good, or do countries like India need to focus very sharply on sovereign models, and yet Sarvam in the morning speak before you? Because at some point in time, the concern is, can this be a global common good, or do we run the risk of becoming a data colony? So let's kickstart from there.
That's great. First of all, thank you for having me here. Thank you all for being here. Apologies for enjoying the Delhi traffic, as we talked about. But you know, it's always, I mean, India is always one of my favorite places to come to, and it sort of relates to the essence of your question. You know, when you get here, even when you get to the airport, and I got in, I think, late on Monday night, like the energy level here, like this is a country that is on the move. I mean, it is the world's largest democracy, but you just, like, I just love the energy here. I also love the food. So it's really a pleasure to be here. I actually thought we were here to talk about cricket. Isn't that the T20 is here, right? But I'm actually going to connect the dots here if I could, because I did think I'll try to connect this. So, you know, I was flying over, and you know, I was surprised to see that the U.S. cricket team, which apparently is called Team B, has actually been relatively competitive. And then I started to look at the roster of the U.S. team, and it was all Indian names, right? Patel's, Navakar, I mean, a bunch of Indian names. And, you know, what it reminded me is the talent that exists here, the density of talent in India. Our office is in San Francisco. You know, when I walk around and I see the researchers, the people who are building this, our lead engineers, our product folks, so many of them are of Indian descent. But what's really interesting about what's going on in this country at this moment, at this time, is the talent is actually here on the ground in India building this. If you look at our underlying stats, and this is, by the way, why I think, you know, India is not just the world's largest democracy, but as the world's largest democracy leading the democratizing of AI, India is our OpenAI's second largest market in the world. There's 100 million people who use chat on a regular basis. But the underneath that number is the fact that around a third of those folks are students, right? So kids K through 12 and also in college. And what that tells me is that not only is AI accessible here, but there's a literacy that is building and developing, and even above and beyond the literacy, there is an agency. People are actually using this technology to build, to produce, to create, to learn, and to think. I think later today, we're gonna, in fact, be announcing a partnership to bring on an additional 100,000 students, working with a number of universities around the country, ITT in Delhi, the tech entity, IIMA, I think, which is the management one, and then AIMS, which really does medical and science. All of that says, like, this country has the energy, it has the talent, and it has people who are building on this day in and day out.
Right, Chris, and that brings us to the entire question on how do you move with both speed and scale? Yeah. And I think if we can talk about almost the world now seeing AI as pre-Chat GPT and post-Chat GPT. Now that's almost become like a timeline, that definition of, what happened post-Chat GPT. The world looks like a different place. And coming from your vantage point, one of the most influential people in AI, globally, the one question we have for you is, how do you plug that AI capability gap? You talked about skilling, you talked about talent density, but there's a capability gap coming on two sides. One is on adoption, and the other is on skilling.
That's right.
So how do you bridge that?
I do think it's, and Sam Altman, our CEO and co-founder, talks a lot about this. This is almost at the core of whether you can successfully democratize AI. So let's unpack that a little bit, because it's a really important question. So we talk about what you referenced, which is the capability overhang. What does that really mean? What it really means is that if you're a power user of OpenAI's tools, our data indicates and suggests that you're 7 times more productive than a non-power user. So that is someone who's using the tech for coding, that is someone who's really using the tech as a multiplier of their productivity. You can almost think about that as they're 7 times more relevant as a productive driving worker than a non. And so we think of almost 3 poles in the ground here. The first is access. Are you making the basic technology accessible? Of the 100 million people who use it here on a regular basis, the vast majority are either using it for free because we give out our service, or our Go tier, which I think is about $3.99 a month in rupees. So access is really foundational. Then there is the adoption. Are you becoming literate in this? And I think when you look at that data I shared on 30 plus million kids, students using this, I think you can make a pretty strong argument that India is leading the way in terms of AI literacy. And if you thought about maybe another general purpose technology like the printing press, like those parts of the world when the printing press came out that really sprinted to becoming literate were the ones that benefited from the shared knowledge. And then the last piece, and I'll come back to you, I'm sorry, is this agency piece. In the US, and I know the US a little bit better than India, but in the US, we built a public education system for the industrial age to teach kids how to work in factories, right? You actually had to teach people the time of the day it started, going from class to class, even how the bells worked. Can we think about our education system to teach people agency, how they can actually become power users of this technology? It lowers barriers, allows them to participate, not just as employees, but potentially as owners and full participants in this economy.
And Rahul, a very important point coming from Chris, they're saying India is leading the way on AI literacy. Coming from, OpenAI, that's a very big statement.
Yeah, I would even say, if I could, and I'll come right back to you, sorry, but India is creating the model of how to close that capability gap because of what it's doing with its students.
Amazing.
But Chris, the moment you say that a power user of AI is 7x as powerful as someone who's not using AI smartly, that brings us to the potential jobless growth paradox. The fact that 7 other people could be doing something which now can be done by 1 person. We've already seen over the last few weeks in India what's been called SaaSpocalypse, the crash in the value of IT services companies. And there are lots of people watching at this time who have jobs in the IT area, and they're very, very concerned about, you're talking about inclusive AI, but how do you come out and address the question of potential joblessness, disruption in the labor market for a country like India?
I think this is probably at the top of the most important questions that we collectively need to take on. We released some data, I think over the weekend or on Monday, I'm losing track of the days, that showed, at least thus far in India, AI is serving as a multiplicator and not an eradicator of jobs. Now, I do think we need to be clear-eyed. If you look at general purpose technologies historically, electricity, the transistor, combustion engine, they typically end up creating more new jobs than jobs that are displaced, but they do displace jobs. And so I think from our perspective, we need to be straight about what we're seeing with the data, but we also need to be thinking about what the real solutions are. We may not be able to come up with every solution, but we need to be making an effort to address solutions. And so one of the things that we've really been focused on is actually creating something called a training and accreditation program, where you're going to be able to come on to OpenAI's platform, basically get taught how to be literate in AI, regardless of your age. You get a credential that you're now literate in AI, and then potentially be able to get connected with prospective jobs. That's not the solution to everything, right? But what it does speak to is that we as a company do need to be committed to looking for those solutions. As I said earlier, I think India starts off in a really advantageous position, given the students who are using this, given the number of people who are using it, given the fact that this is one of the countries in the world that's leading in terms of developers building on AI. This country is just so incredibly positioned to be a leader in this intelligence age that's coming. You talked about the before and the after. I think if you look around the world, India is as well positioned as any country, but we are going to have to all work together to really be able to help address that jobs issue.
Right, Chris, as you talk about, how we're going to plug this capability gap, the other question and the other, I would say, worry for policymakers, if they're having sleepless nights right now, is around this whole question of national security, of sovereignty. And I know you've talked a lot about it. You advise governments as well. You've been at the forefront.
Yeah.
Today, one concern for policymakers is what's happening on jobs. And as Rahul had mentioned, how do you create net job growth rather than displacement? So that's one part of the conversation on the AI debate. The other part is on pure infrastructures. As this technology plays out, how do you balance bringing in capital as well as ensuring that you are taking care of your sovereign interests?
Yeah, these are all great questions. You talked about waking up at night. I do wake up almost every night at around 3 a.m. Every time I say this, I realize I do have to say I do typically go back to bed. But the three things that wake me up are, one, how are we thinking about the democratizing of this, particularly on the jobs and economic participation front? Two is the geopolitics.
Right.
The world's going to have a choice over the next decade or so to build out on either small d democratic AI or autocratic AI. Democratic AI is open, it supports the individual, it follows the rule of law. But the only way you can sort of address the jobs issue and the democratizing piece is whether you build the infrastructure. Infrastructure is destiny. We're going to have a little bit more to share, by the way, from the OpenAI perspective in the next couple of days at this summit on the infrastructure piece. The PM, the Prime Minister, has obviously been giving a great deal of thought to this. And our commitment here is to work with the government and the private sector to build AI that's going to be of, for, and by India. And that means making sure that you do have the infrastructure in place, which is ultimately a combination of energy, chips, data, and the talent piece that we had talked about earlier. India is very well positioned.
It's great to hear that from you, Chris, but at the same time, how do you reassure Indian policymakers that when OpenAI is seeing India as a huge market, and that's given the population scale that we have. But at the same time, you're not here to just capitalize on that data opportunity, because that's the one question that comes up every time. That is India safeguarding its interests, and while everybody would want to embrace technology, are we seeing a situation where we should be doing a bit more around those safeguards?
Yes, let me make a macro point and then a micro point. The macro here, and it's understandable that people sometimes think about AI and almost fight the last battle or the last war and sort of think about this as social media.
Right.
This is not social media, right? This is an infrastructure, general purpose technology. Again, the wheel, the combustion engine, electricity, transistor. And if you look at the course of human history, right? Humans have been around roughly 200,000 years. For the first 190,000 of those, life was pretty static. It wasn't a great life. You basically could produce what you could consume. And then, about 10,000 years ago, we begin to get these general purpose technologies. And there's like the hockey stick in terms of progress. And so I do think it's really important to understand that this is a productivity driving technology. It is the equivalent of getting electricity, and then what do you build on top of that electricity here in India? And as we've talked about, right, this is a country that's leading the world amongst the leaders and the developers. If you look at GitHub, which is a good criteria for seeing who's building, like India is leading or one of those leaders in terms of developers out there. Those represent the next generation of jobs, the next generation of revenue, the next generation of companies that are going to be built here on the ground in India. And then I think a very specific point on the data piece, which I do think is really, really important.
Right.
I do think, for India to build inference models off of that infrastructure, it is certainly going to want to give serious thought to how it approaches the data piece. In other countries around the world, and I think presumably here, there's a data localization so that India can make sure that its data stays here. We're already working really at the guidance of the government to build our models that speak the 25 different national languages that exist here. But what's really important if you're going to have AI of, for, and by India is that the model here, the inference model here, reflects culture, reflects the languages, reflects the context, and that is part of the piece that's inherent to actually building that kind of sovereign AI, certainly what we're committed to. And we, again, look at this not as an extractive technology in the way perhaps maybe social media was to some level. This is a productivity. This is bringing economic activity here.
So you're basically giving a message that, you know what, we're not here to come extract the data. We want to work with the governments as well as with the sovereign models here.
It's the only way. There's almost like an inherent social contract to this. Like, we will only grow here if India is growing. We will only succeed here if Indians are succeeding with this technology on the ground. It's why we're so focused on closing that capability gap.
Chris, let's speak about regulation.
Yeah.
Looked at from the lens of safety and gatekeeping. You spoke of democratic AI versus autocratic AI. And you know, Sam Altman's been traveling the world asking for a global body for regulation. But given the fact that there is such a rupture in terms of what China is building and the tech companies in San Francisco are building, there are serious concerns about how this technology should be regulated, in what form and shape, and whether the world then potentially gets split into two camps. And in this China-US India triangulation, where does Delhi come out in terms of regulation? What's your sense on that?
Yeah, so it's all really, really smart questions. I think of regulation almost at three levels here. First of all, this is a new technology, and when you have a new technology, particularly a general purpose technology, you do want to think about this as new rules for a new thing. You don't necessarily want to look at old rules, because if you impose old rules, you potentially stifle the innovation, particularly in a place like India, which is leading, on the innovation. I think, secondly, the way we think about this technology is through something called iterative deployment, right? So every time we have progress in terms of the technology, we release it in a staged way so that both we and broader society can adapt and adopt to the new technology. I do think India is giving that an awful lot of thought. And then I think really the third piece here comes back to something that we've talked about already a couple times, but I do think really does bear reinforcing, which is ultimately this is a technology that should empower individuals. It lowers the barrier, allows people to scale, an individual's ability to learn, to think, to create, to produce. And so how do you make sure you're getting this into as many people's hands as possible? If you look at that broad history of general purpose technologies, those countries that have been able to harness it and succeed the most have been those countries that really focused on the democratizing of the tech. And I do think one of the larger debates, this is a sort of a philosophical debate that's taking place within AI right now, is sort of this two paths, right? One path is this is so powerful that only a small number of people should control this and should be able to make decisions about it. In my view, that will just mean that you sort of perpetuate the status quo, that the powerful will be able to use this to become more powerful. There's another view, and certainly the OpenAI view, it reflects our purpose and our mission, and that is to democratize this, get this into as many hands of as many people as possible, that people are generally good. And you think about a place like India, and I began this conversation by talking about the energy that exists here. What drives that energy is an optimism in the future. And this technology can really drive progress in an incredible way. But the way to guarantee that or optimize for that is to make sure democratizing access to it. So for me, from a regulatory or policy-making perspective, really thinking about it from that context.
Chris, we've been having very active conversations with the government around regulations and AI, and you've been talking about it as well. The thinking within the government right now is that there's no need for an overarching new regulation to sort of regulate this new technology, because the existing data privacy laws, as well as what we're seeing play out, seem to cover for most of the risk or harm. And the Prime Minister himself has been very, very vocal that he sees AI as a force for good, and anything that could throttle or come in the way of innovation is something he's not keen on. However, we're seeing some pieces of regulatory intervention come in. And the one area where I'd love to get your views is on copyright. Because we have seen the government come out with some form of a regulation or at least a proposal, and we've been also talking to your teams actively about it. But what's your thought when governments are grappling with this? Do we need to rewrite copyright rules suddenly in the wake of what's happening?
Yeah, so there's a consultation process that the government has kicked off that we're fully participating in. This is a really important question and a complex question, and a question that if you really do want to have sovereign AI, that any country, inclusive of India, is really going to need to get right. Amongst the reasons that the US has historically been a leader in technology, really since the founding of the US 250 years ago, is we do have a principle that's embedded in the US Constitution, and it's called fair use. And the simple version of fair use, I won't do the whole legal disquisition on it, but the simple version of it is that people should be able to use technology to build on itself, because that then drives a nation's progress. In the AI context, the way we think about fair use is, I'll use an analogy. I can go to a library, I can read a book, I can learn from that book, and then I can go do my own thing based on the knowledge that I gain. That's how these big training models, in effect, work. They should not spit out things that are exact replicas of what they have read, but they should be able to build off of what they have learned. And so I think, as India approaches this issue, it's really, really important that it gets it right. I do think it's critical that you respect and honor the labor that goes into the production of content. I also think it's incredibly important that India thinks about the role that data is going to play in its sovereign AI. I mean, I talked earlier that what are the critical components of infrastructure? It is the chips, it is the energy, it's the talent, but it is the data. And if India wants to have models that do reflect India's society and culture and language, mores, you are going to want Indian data that gets built into those models at some level. Again, not spitting out stuff on the other side, but informed by the Indian context. And I do think that that's going to be an important part of those conversations, and I think critical for India having sovereign AI.
Chris, OpenAI has formally told US lawmakers that you think that Chinese AI startups like DeepSeek are using models like distillation to steal from OpenAI's research. Mm-hmm. How strong is the body of evidence that you have to suggest that Chinese AI startups are actually stealing from your research models? And what is OpenAI doing at this moment to try and prevent that from happening?
Yeah, so we do an awful lot to make sure we're trying to protect the integrity of our models. There's and I think generally, and there was some news that came out at the end of last week that we shared with the U.S. government, that did document how something called distillation is taking place. And that is, in effect, when AI companies out of China, are basically sort of bombarding our model to take as much of the IP or underlying model information as possible. That does happen. We do an awful lot to try to mitigate that and protect from it. But this is going to be an incredibly important issue that is going to play out as we think about that democratic versus autocratic AI, right? US companies, Indian companies, others are all going to be facing this challenge. I think if you take a big step back, what's really at stake here is, as the world looks over the next decade or so, are we going to build out on that democratic AI or autocratic AI? And the leader of the People's Republic of China has made really clear that they do want to prevail in that competition. I typically would not quote Vladimir Putin, but in this case, he has said that whoever wins that competition between democratic nations and autocratic nations ends up winning the world. I think India is going to play a decisive role in all of this as the world's largest democracy.
Is this a binary? Is it a zero-sum game? How real, according to you, is the fear of bad actors using bioterrorism or this technology going rogue and being deployed either by states, deep states, or rogue actors to actually wreak havoc? And over the last several days in particular, there's been so much doomsday commentary online. It's been viraling in an insane fashion, which basically suggests the end is near in terms of the moment where this technology can potentially go rogue. A lot of AI companies themselves have written in their simulations, the models have done things which they didn't anticipate them to.
Yeah, so I think where we come at this is a little bit more of an optimistic view. We are realists. We do build all sorts of safety mechanisms into our models before they are publicly released. And I think one of the things that Sam talks about, and you'll probably hear him talk about, at this Impact Summit, is how does society start to build resilience out there? Let me give you a specific example. In the US, there is something that was formerly called the AI Safety Institute. It's now called CASE. There's a version of this that exists in the UK, in Japan, in Singapore. India is thinking of versions of this. And what these safety institutes are in effect developing are global standards, particularly for those democratic countries. Global standards for the release of models on those catastrophic issues that you are alluding to. This is why, at least in our view, the importance of building out democratic AI is really going to be critical to the future, which is you do want to, as part of building out democratic AI, you do want to create those global safety standards that everyone is in effect building off of. And by the way, as you do that, you also are equipping those societies with the best tech to be able to then have resilience and be able to combat people who may be looking to do bad things with this.
Chris, we know you're running late for your next meeting, and we're well over time. So before we
this is the most important thing of the day. Are you kidding?
We love that. We love that. And if we had our way, we would hold you back the whole day and continue this conversation. But we do want to respect your time. Before we let you go, Chris, the one question I have for you, and we'd love to hear that from you.
Yeah.
One advice to government on the one thing they need to unlearn in the age of AI.
This is a productivity-driving technology. It is not social media. You want to make sure that your people are generating and creating as much agency as possible. Those countries that develop agency in AI with their population are going to be the countries that lead the AI revolution. India right now is at the front of that. And India needs to continue doing what it's currently doing.
All right, the message coming from...
Yeah. Because your book is called The Masters of Disaster.
Yeah.
Right? When you look at what's happening with AI right now, and if you were rewriting a book for the AI intelligence age, how close or how far from disaster do you think? Forget what OpenAI is doing, but somebody with a ringside view, when you're seeing the models being proliferated by the others, how far or how close from disaster are we?
I feel, given what we're doing and what I'm aware the other leading frontier model companies, the other companies building frontier models are doing, I think, across the board, certainly from the US side, people are putting out models in a really responsible way. So I feel, I've said this a couple times, but I genuinely feel optimistic about where this technology is going. Will there be issues that we confront just like with any other historic general purpose technology? Sure. But then I think about all the incredible things that are going to come, right? We're already seeing, scientific progress where we're being able to solve science questions and issues that at times would have taken years, we can now do in days, if not hours, right? That's then going to lead to incredible breakthroughs in science. What we're seeing in terms of healthcare outcomes, you think of the size of India and the rural populations and how this technology could really deliver healthcare outcomes here in India. We're already seeing our technology. It's taking place right here in India, helping to educate students. Imagine every kid in the world could have an individualized tutor, at their fingertips. We would not be in the middle of this. We would not be doing this. Sam wouldn't be leading on this. Our researchers wouldn't be building this day in and day out if they didn't fundamentally believe that this was going to drive the type of historic progress that we believe it can drive.
For taking our time and joining us on what's been a busy and chaotic day, Chris Lehane, thank you very much. We wish you all the best.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much. Pleasure talking to you.
Enjoy the Tigers of Ranthambore. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great.